So beginning on Thursday then, Mr. Prigozhin from Wagner Group put out this piece of video, having yet another attempt at a go at the Russian military establishment, and Sergei Shoigu and Commander-in-Chief Valery Gerasimov in particular. But of course, we've seen these types of things before, so although it was quite a strong comment, nobody thought too much about it. But then on Friday, they released another piece of video. This was it. And Vanessa, very briefly, this was said to be an attack by the Russian military on the Wagner Group, and there were said to be bodies everywhere, but there were no bodies apparently in the video clip itself.
No, I mean, to put it mildly, this is a very inconclusive clip.
Yes. Indeed, it is. So then on Saturday, then we had the tanks rolling into Rostov. Apparently, Rostov's military assets are under our control, said Prigozhin, including the airfield. Jets that are leaving for battle in Ukraine are leaving as scheduled. There are no issues as far as he was concerned. Medical planes taking off, no problems there. He was very comfortable. He thought that was 7:30 in the morning. 8 o'clock, then Putin puts out a statement described as looking very stern, but this was the statement that went out. But in the meantime, what did we have? We had video footage coming out on Saturday of the Wagner material rolling into Rostov. But if you look in the background there, you can see people just getting on with their days as usual. So at this point, it didn't seem, at least as far as the local populations were concerned, it didn't seem that there was anything terribly unusual going on. But then there was other video appearing, and I've just taken a still from this one, showing the tanks in the streets with the Wagner troops on the ground there with their guns and so on. But if you look on the left-hand side of that, people seem to be walking right up to these guys with no particular concern. So it's all a bit of a strange picture going on there. But in the meantime, various media comments, well, this is from Ukrainian press, images of helicopter allegedly downed by Wagner Group shared on Russian social media. And the sources that they list here are Astra and Baza and Russian Telegram channels. They describe them RT, that what they describe a pro-Kremlin Russian media outlet and so on. This is a Kiev Independent. Ukraine's Air Force, Wagner mercenaries downed 6 Russian army helicopters, 1 plane on June the 24th. So that was the mainstream media, at least from the Ukrainian side, pushing this out. I didn't see very much from the Russian side on this at all, but this was CNN then, reported by Il Russo. US expected a lot more bloodshed in Russia, official says. So the CNN certainly pretty unhappy that the bloodshed didn't seem to be appearing. There were these reports of downed aircraft. There seems to be some inconclusive statements around that. In the meantime, then, as time went on, the question of what was going to happen, because the coup, as it was being described in the West, had clearly failed. What was going to happen to Prigozhin? But this is Dmitry Peskov saying, you will ask me what will happen to Prigozhin himself. A criminal case against him will be dropped, said Dmitry Peskov. And then he went on to say, if you're asking me what guarantees that Prigozhin can go to Belarus, that's the word of the Russian president. So he was absolutely certain that Prigozhin was going to be allowed to go to Belarus. And indeed, on Saturday, it appears that he did do that. The video footage came out. An agreement was done with the Belarusian government, apparently. And, well, Peskov had this to say: an agreement was reached. The PMC Wagner groups would return to their camps and places of deployment. Some of them, if they wish to do so, can later ink contracts with the Defense Ministry. It also applies to fighters who decided against taking part in this armed mutiny. Now, Peskov was being quoted by TASS here, and it was them that chose to put the term armed mutiny in single quotes, as we saw on screen there. But Peskov went on. He said, the special military operation continues. Our fighters on the front line display heroism. They're deflecting the counter-offensive by Ukraine's armed forces extremely effectively. and the operation will continue. Because as this was progressing over the last few days, the thought did occur to me, Vanessa, what is Russia doing while everybody's distracted with this? Everybody's looking at what's going on with this apparent coup attempt. And the question is, what's Russia going to do? And of course, what they did was they absolutely brought more reinforcements onto the front lines and so on. So if we just bring this on screen, this is Ulruso again. This was their comments on it. So they're talking about the continued attacks by Ukraine, no breakthrough, their attacks blunted, stopped, and their equipment destroyed by Russian combined arms, mines, artillery, thermobaric rocket systems, and so on. So clearly what was going on the front was absolutely under control. And then in the meantime, these comments basically saying that the front stands. Ukraine is trying to restart a stalled counteroffensive. Well, this is Brian's comments here. I would expect the 15 armed fists are part of the final Ukrainian reserves, and these will be the normal limited number of armor and vehicles with a few hundred men each. The Russians are now practiced in destroying such attacks. And then today, again, I suppose to demonstrate that everything is business as usual. In fact, Sergei Shoigu has headed off to the front lines himself. So this is a quite incredible situation where all this was going on, Vanessa. But in the meantime, on the front, the Russians were not distracted in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, and neither largely were civilians in Moscow. The first video you showed, actually, Mike, is of the Chechen fighters arriving in Rostov to quell the armed insurrection, or the alleged armed insurrection. One, of course, has to ask where those heavily armed troops now are. And as you've already alluded to, did Russia use this event, and I'll go on to look into this in greater depth in my section, but did they use this event and NATO's distraction to effectively reinforce their front lines without drawing attention to it? Because of course, as shown by the media in the West, everyone was focused on the potential of a regime change inside Russia, effectively.
Right. Well, so let's move on to this now. You want to begin with a little bit of video with Andrei Martyanov. Is that how? Yes.
Yeah. So Andrei Martyanov, who's a former, I think it's Navy, Russian Navy, living in the US. But I just want to show this first little section of his idea of what went on.
Obviously, the fact of the Prigozhin having the connections with the foreign, so to speak, services is now pretty well established, actually, and I will explain why. And Medvedev basically speaks about it, about the international participation in that, and that essentially it was, as I spoke today with my dear friends in Russia, and we did even podcast, sadly it's not downloadable on YouTube and it's in Russian anyway, we came to a conclusion that it all was, and you can actually see there some hand here of some organization from one small island which still considers itself to be important. The whole thing was most likely designed in such a way as to coincide with the breach of the first line of defense of Russian armed forces in Ukraine during this counteroffensive. But we all know what this counteroffensive turned into. It turned into a complete slaughter of the armed forces of Ukraine, their elite units, their strategic reserve, and of course the slaughter and basically burning of everything the NATO equipped them with. And the idea was that once you breach the first line, or maybe even second line of defense of Russian armed forces, you throw in there what is called the units for exploitation of the breach or the breakthrough, and then suddenly you have the mutiny from Wagner Group, which suddenly becomes what? Huge military political problem for Kremlin, and there you go. And suddenly you can talk about that, oh, some people will support them. And here comes the issue. issue. If we accept this theory, again, make no mistake, I'm not saying that this is necessarily true, but the probability of this is highly likely, if we'll use the famous Western media lingo. Then actually once you really started the ticker, once you started the clock, which you cannot turn off, this is what happened. They just didn't expect that basically armed forces of Ukraine will be slaughtered. And then suddenly there is no actually some kind of the military factor which you can rely upon in order for you to start actually some kind of not just mutiny, but coup d'etat.
Okay, so.
Oh, sorry. So, sorry, I didn't realize I was back on then.
Yeah.
So basically, what I kind of want people to notice is the fact that Martynov was smiling quite a lot during that description of what he believes happened. And then I want to basically bring it together with this analysis from Larry Johnson. This is at his own blog, Russia's Academy Award-winning performance for best coup, Prigozhin scores best actor. Let's have a look at who Larry Johnson is or used to be. So he's a former CIA operative and the State Department's Office of Counterterrorism, and provided training to the US military special operations community for 24 years. So he's no newcomer to intelligence circles. So let's have a look at what he believes is going on. And by the way, he complimented Andrei Martynov on his summary of events. So there is a collation between the two. So basically what he's pointing out, first of all, is that the Wagner Group was established by Russian intelligence. It's funded and still is funded by the Russian government. Prigozhin has been shooting his mouth off for a few months with no recriminations from the Kremlin. The coup was launched because Russia allegedly attacked Wagner camp. As we said, the video shows no bodies. And Prigozhin himself now backs away from this story and claims that the main reason that they carried out this mutiny was because basically Wagner were about to be incorporated into Russian military, and so they would lose their independence. So that's his current story for the reason behind this coup. The Russian government effectively waited 12 hours before sending police or military to the Wagner HQ in St. Petersburg. That's a pretty long time if this is a serious threat to the nation. Prigozhin reportedly ordered a column of Wagner troops to go from Rostov-on-Don to Moscow to dethrone Shoigu and maybe General Gerasimov. But let's have a look at the map showing exactly what that would actually entail. So even in a normal car, it's more than 13 hours from Rostov to Moscow. And yet the claims were that the column of Wagner, I presume armored vehicles, etc., had arrived to within 120 kilometers of Moscow, which is virtually impossible. They had no air support. So presumably, if this was a genuine threat to the Kremlin, the Russian Air Force, the Russian forces, the Russian military, particularly if it was true that the Wagner troops had brought down the number of helicopters and planes claimed by Western media or the Kiev Independent, and which I would currently speculate is completely untrue. They would have attacked the column before it even arrived anywhere near that close to Moscow. So then Johnson goes on to say the coup was orchestrated to allow movement of Russian reinforcements to areas north and west of Voronezh, while NATO believed mobilization was to suppress an insurrection by Prigozhin. Well, that makes sense. The narrative of Prigozhin betrayal began in 2022 when allegedly Western intelligence reached out to him and he informed Russian intelligence of the contacts. The decision was then taken to exploit the disgruntled patriot narrative, even allowing Prigozhin to launch verbal attacks on Shoigu and Gerasimov. The Jack Teixeira Discord leaks Prigozhin even allegedly passed intel on the locations of Russian troops to his intel handler in the West. And again, this is where the crossover between Martynov and Johnson comes. Martynov mentions the unimportant little island that still thinks it's important, and we all know that he means the UK. Johnson then continues.
Yeah, sorry. There we go.
No worry. So basically, his conclusion, and everyone can go and read his actual article, that it was stage managed by the Kremlin. They knew what NATO was trying to foment inside Russia, and what it enabled them to do is to move the troops closer to the border and then disperse them, which means Russia found a way to reinforce troops on a new potential axis of attack that will effectively create a nightmare for NATO planners. I would also say what it did do was to expose those who might support a NATO agenda inside Russia and those that would be sympathetic to any kind of regime change or coup d'etat inside Russia. So it exposed the potential opposition or even the enemies of the state within Russia, within all the institutions. And it enabled Russia to reinforce their front lines and destroy any kind of counterattack by Ukraine.
So, Vanessa, something we've got to stress here is this is some analysis of the events.
Yeah.
But at this point, really, nobody knows exactly what has gone on.
No, nobody knows what has gone on. But when you start to look at the logical, rational explanations for what's gone on, it starts to narrow down to this. The fact that Martynov, let's say, gave credibility to the idea of the coup. Now, is he doing that because that supports the kind of the Kremlin narrative, right, to deceive NATO, right? And we have to remember that Russia has a history of outwitting the MI6. When it came into Syria in 2015, when you read the book of Tim Ripley, for example, Operation Aleppo, it's very clear that American and British intelligence agencies really had no idea, and the military had no idea that Russia was planning to intervene at Syria in September 2015. So I think all we're doing at the moment is sort of untangling the official narratives, looking at the narratives that are below the radar. And also, let's look at what Western media did almost immediately, almost as if this was prepared earlier. And of course, we have a history of that from Western media. So let's have a look at a few of the headlines. Did Putin bribe coup leader to quit Russia? Wagner mutineers turn back after striking deal with Putin. Rebel chief halts tank advance on Moscow to stop bloodshed. And this is another point. Prigozhin himself stated that he wanted to prevent bloodshed. So if he wanted to prevent bloodshed, does that mean there was no prior bloodshed? In other words, they didn't bring down those Russian planes and helicopters as claimed by Western media. So Russian rebellion, Putin at the brink, Putin pushed to the brink. And I think my favorite, or probably the most sort of criminally insane, comes from The Atlantic, and Applebaum, who was also equally unpleasant and criminally disinforming on Syria. Russia slides into civil war. And I'm not laughing at the fact that Russia might slide into a civil war. That would be awful and have terrible repercussions for the world. But it's insane, this headline. And then somebody put out a sort of a spoof Wikipedia, which is Russian Civil War of 2023. But in reality, if you go to the actual real Wikipedia page, it's not that far off. It's Wagner Rebellion 2023. So all of these agencies that are aligned with NATO foreign policy jumped immediately to the conclusion that this was effectively a coup d'etat against Russia. And of course, they were sorely disappointed.
Yes, and indeed, if we just put that Wikipedia thing back on again for 1 second, the discussion thread with the people that created that spoof Wikipedia page, was a big long discussion underneath about it, and in that they even commented on the official Wikipedia page about the Russian about the Wagner coup, saying, well, actually, that Wikipedia page is almost identical to this spoof in terms of its ridiculousness.
Exactly.
So, and then there was one other quote that I just wanted to highlight, and this came from the Guardian, and perhaps it gives a little bit of weight to the suggestion that this coup attempt was understood by the Russians, or there was some agreement between them and Prigozhin over this, because the quote from them was, at first, some observers wondered if Prigozhin had secretly coordinated this uprising with the Kremlin. This conspiratorial version turned out to be wrong. So if that conspiratorial version has turned out to be wrong, according to The Guardian, maybe we need to be giving it some serious consideration. But anyway, go ahead.
No, I mean, as soon as they claim that something's a conspiracy, I tend to think we're over target, basically.
Yes. Now, we have a little bit of video from St. Petersburg that you just wanted to highlight. We're just going to play a few seconds of it, but if you introduce it then.
Yeah. So basically, this was on the night of, this was before Prigozhin had taken the deal and headed off to Belarus, right? So this is in St. Petersburg. And this was the Scarlet Sails open air event in St. Petersburg for high school graduates. Something like 65,000 16 to 17-year-olds came out to celebrate, including several hundred that had come to Russia for safety from Donbass. And there were absolutely no police incidents, you'll be glad to know, Mike.
Okay.
С чего начинается Родина? С картинки в твоем букваре, с хороших и верных товарищей, живущих в соседнем дворе. А может, она начинается с той песни, что пела нам мать, с того, что в любых испытаниях.
Okay, so that gives an impression of that. Now, look, in the meantime, perhaps something else that might give a little bit of weight, and I'd say that with a fairly big perhaps on it, that the Russians were prepared for what Prigozhin finally did, was actually what's been going on in Syria in the last couple of days.
Yeah, absolutely. This is actually where, for me, I start to see confirmation of what we've just been talking about. Because just before the Prigozhin so-called mutiny, the Republican Guard, a division of the Syrian Arab Army, moved or mobilized heavy artillery, heavy machinery to the north of Syria. So this was just before the Prigozhin, a few days before Prigozhin kicked off. And in obvious preparation for a campaign against the Northwest, the terrorists backed by the West and Turkey in the Northwest, effectively Idlib, to the north, which is Turkey and the US, and to the Northeast, which of course is the US and the Kurds, occupying Syrian oil and agricultural resources. And then the terrorists started to, particularly in the northwest, close to Latakia on the coast and from Idlib, started to target civilian areas in Latakia. They actually targeted Kurdaha, which was the birthplace of Hafiz al-Assad, killing a young agricultural engineer, Mohammed Sultana, and injuring his brother. They attacked various towns and villages in northern Hama, bordering southern Idlib. And then when Prigozhin, the entire sort of event kicked off, we suddenly saw a massive increase in Russian bombing and Syrian Arab Army artillery offensive against terrorist positions, including drone factories, ammunition stores, headquarters of terrorist militants. They were hitting multiple targets. To give you an idea, this morning alone, between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m., Russia conducted more than 35 sorties, 35 bombings. That's unheard of in the entire conflict in Syria. And they've attacked basically Al Zawiya mountain, which is on the southern Idlib border with the Syrian Arab Army held territory in northern Hama. They attacked West Idlib multiple times. They attacked Jisr al-Shugur, Kobane Hills. So this has been, and that's with the support of Syrian Arab Army artillery. So they have taken a pounding, and it's a pounding that I don't think anyone in Idlib, none of the terrorist groups were prepared for. As you can see, this is a young Al-Qaeda or HTS activist talking about the bombing. This is to basically the west of Idlib. Of course, he's not going to mention that these are terrorist headquarters, particularly drone manufacturing factories. Turkey has been enabling particularly Jolani and HTS or Al-Qaeda to manufacture fairly sophisticated drones that have been carrying out attacks against Syrian Arab Army positions and even against Russian military positions fairly recently. That's not something that is very well known. And so therefore, for me, what this means is that Russia took advantage of the Prigozhin distraction to conduct a very extensive, intensive air campaign against the terrorist positions, and even to the point where there was a violation of the deconfliction zone by US Air Force this morning. And also, Mike, I want to add here that General Milley and Jake Sullivan have both cancelled their intended trips. Now, General Milley was intending to go to Jordan and Israel, and I would speculate there, was he going to go there on the basis that he thought the terrorists would have started their campaign against the Syrian Arab Army and he was going to Jordan and Israel to garner support? And then he cancelled because the Prigozhin plot fell apart. Again, that's speculation, but it's worthy speculation. And Jake Sullivan cancelled his trip to Denmark. So for me, that would sort of suggest that things are not going to plan for them.
Yes. Okay, thank you for that. And I just want to end this segment very quickly. This is Il Russo again, commenting on the Chinese assessment of the events of the last few days. The Chinese saying that the suppression of the rebellion in such a short period of time has effectively strengthened the authority of the Putin administration. And I wanted to contrast that with what Tobias Ellwood was pushing out this morning. This is his tweet. He's saying that the Wagner Group has been neutered, Prigozhin has been exiled, the mutiny's been diffused, but that Putin has been irreversibly weakened. And so there's a definite disparity between what Tobias Ellwood thinks and what the Chinese are saying. And I leave it up to our audience to decide who might be more accurate in their assessment.